An 89-year-old frail man entered a cafe and simply requested a sandwich. He was met with disdain and humiliation. However, among the patrons, a wealthy woman was observing the scene intently. Her gaze was fixed on something on his wrist, and suddenly she froze. With her heart racing, she approached him, and when she realized what it truly was, her face went pale. The gentle aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, blending with the low murmur of customers in the bustling cafe. It was an ordinary day, but a peculiar silence enveloped the place when the door opened, revealing an elderly man. His steps were slow, almost dragging as he crossed the threshold. Old J.P.E., at 89, was visibly worn out by life. His thin, stooped body bore not just the weight of age, but also years of suffering. His tattered, faded clothes offered little protection from the biting cold of the day, and his nearly soulless shoes exposed his toes. He navigated through the room with trembling hands, ignoring the disapproving stares of the customers he passed. The discreet murmurs, which to him sounded like direct judgments, combined with the pain of his empty stomach, urged him to keep moving. Each step was a battle between his dignity and necessity. J.P.E. barely lifted his eyes, fearing the obvious disdain in the air. He knew his presence was unwelcome, but he had no other choice. Remember to leave a like and don't miss any details of this emotional story. Arriving at the counter, he placed his few coins on the surface. The owner of the establishment, Marcella, a middle-aged woman known for her cold demeanor, looked him up and down with a disgusted expression. Her apron, once white, was stained with spilled coffee, but the look she gave J.P.E. was even more stained with prejudice. "I just wanted the cheapest sandwich, please," J.P.E. said in a low voice, barely audible over the murmurs around him. His soiled fingers fumbled with the coins, trying to project some confidence. Marcella crossed her arms, her expression stern. "This isn't a homeless shelter, old man," she said in a harsh tone that made J.P.E. shudder. "If you don't have money, don't eat." Feeling the weight of humiliation, J.P.E. took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Please, J.P.E., anything you can give me. I'm hungry." The plea was almost a whisper, but the desperation in his eyes was unmistakable. The atmosphere around him felt even heavier. Some customers whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with his presence, but no one offered to help. "Do you think you can come in here and ask for free food?" Marcella retorted, leaning in close to J.P.E., her voice dripping with contempt. "We don't have leftovers here. Go somewhere else." The whispers turned into quiet laughter. A nearby customer shook his head with a sarcastic smile. "That's right. Get out of here, old man. We don't want your company." With tears in his eyes, J.P.E. froze. He didn't know whether to leave or insist a little more. His stomach growled, and shame consumed him. He felt invisible, as if his entire life was being judged. In that moment, the awkward silence that filled the space felt even heavier on him. He wanted to disappear, but his legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, when everything seemed lost and hope slipped away from his thoughts, the cafe door opened again. The entrance of an elegant, determined woman caught everyone's attention. Isabella, with her well-groomed brown hair and wearing a sharp suit, walked confidently through the room. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene unfolding before her. Without hesitation, Isabella approached the counter. The atmosphere changed immediately. Marcella, who moments earlier had displayed her arrogance, now seemed uncertain upon realizing the arrival of this influential woman. Isabella was not an ordinary customer. She was known in the city for her luxury boutiques. Her presence commanded respect. "What's the issue here?" Isabella asked, her voice firm and controlled but laden with disapproval. Her gaze fixed on J.P.E., who was still motionless, trying to maintain the dignity he had left. Marcella attempted to regain her composure, but Isabella was the center of attention in the cafe, waiting for the unfolding of this unexpected intervention. The tension in the air was palpable. Isabella looked at J.P.E. and, with a reassuring smile, extended her hand. "Don't worry, sir. Today your lunch is on me." Old J.P.E. looked at her in disbelief, his tear-filled eyes now shining with a glimmer of hope. Isabella turned her gaze to Marcella, who, still surprised by the interruption, was trying to maintain her authority. The tension that had previously existed between J.P.E. and Marcella was now directed entirely toward Isabella, who exuded a subtle yet undeniable strength. "I already said this man cannot be served here," Marcella insisted defensively, trying to regain control of the situation. "This isn't a place for that kind of person." Isabella remained calm, but her eyes displayed an intensity that made Marcella hesitate. "That kind of person?" Isabella repeated, leaning slightly forward. "I believe we're talking about a human being, not an animal." The customers who had been entertained by Jape's humiliation now watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The scene had shifted dramatically. Isabella, with her firm and determined posture, refused to back down. JPE, who had kept his head down until then, raised his eyes toward the woman defending him. His trembling hands still clutched the few coins he had painstakingly gathered. He didn't know if he should say something, but the words were stuck in his throat, crushed by shame. "I will pay for anything he needs," Isabella said, turning her attention back to JPE. "He has the same right to be here as any other customer." Her eyes moved over the faces around, challenging anyone to contradict her. Marcella, trying to regain control, scoffed. "We don't offer charity here. If he can't pay, he shouldn't be here. That's our business." "Business?" Isabella interrupted, not changing her tone but with a slight ironic smile on her lips. "Businesses are made of people, Marcella, and you seem to have forgotten that." She took a step forward, moving even closer to the counter, now speaking for all to hear. "I've been a customer here for years, and I never imagined I would witness something so inhumane." The whispers among the customers stopped, and silence took over the place. Marcella was visibly flustered. She knew Isabella's reputation in the city was strong, and any confrontation could harm her image. However, her arrogance still kept her firm. "This isn't a charity center," Marcella said, crossing her arms as if that could strengthen her position. "If he doesn't have money, I can't help him." Isabella let out a brief laugh, but her eyes remained piercing. "You talk about charity, but you don't realize you're treating a person as if they were less than that. Charity is a choice. Humanity shouldn't be." JPE, who had been silently observing, felt a whirlwind of emotions. It was rare for someone to intercede for him, especially with such fervor. The humiliation he had felt earlier began to dissolve into surprise. He never expected that anyone, let alone a distinguished woman like Isabella, would defend him. He could barely hold back the tears forming in his eyes. Noticing Jape's shaken look, Isabella leaned slightly, speaking more softly. "You can eat whatever you want today." She placed her hand over his, gently pushing the coins back. "Keep this. Don't worry about it." Marcella, feeling the embarrassment grow with each passing second, tried to wrap up the conversation. "Very well. If that's what you want, so be it. But this won't happen again," she muttered, her pride still wounded. Isabella, undeterred, simply smiled lightly and responded calmly. "What won't happen again, Marcella, is how you treat people here, because I will make sure everyone knows how your business operates." Marcella froze, aware that her words could have consequences. Meanwhile, the other customers avoided direct involvement, but it was clear that many were now reconsidering what they had witnessed. JPE, finally regaining some dignity, was led to a table by one of the staff, still under Isabella's watchful eye. She followed him with her gaze, feeling a mix of sadness and satisfaction. There was something about this man that stirred a deep empathy within her, a connection she couldn't quite explain. As JPE settled into his chair, Isabella walked over and pulled out a chair for herself. "Now, sir, what would you like to eat? You're hungry, so let's take care of that." Her tone, once firm and challenging, was now warm and inviting. JPE, unsure how to express his gratitude, murmured, "I don't know how to thank you for what you're doing for me." Isabella smiled, shaking her head. "No need to thank me, JPE. Let's just start with a good lunch, and then we can talk." Isabella watched closely as the waiter, still somewhat reluctant, brought Jape's plate. He placed the sandwich and a cup of coffee on the table without showing enthusiasm, but under Isabella's stern gaze, he didn't dare say a word. JPE looked at the plate in front of him with a mix of surprise and gratitude. His fingers, still trembling, slowly reached for the bread, but hesitated, as if he were waiting for it all to be a dream ready to evaporate at any moment. "You can eat," Isabella encouraged, with a gentle smile that contrasted with her earlier firmness. "It's yours. You deserve it." JPE nodded, grateful, and took his first bite of the sandwich. The hunger seemed to dissolve all the shame and embarrassment he had felt just moments before. He chewed slowly, almost reverently, while Isabella watched him calmly, trying to process the strange feeling that filled her chest. It was a mix of compassion and something deeper, something that made her feel an inexplicable connection to this man. As JPE ate, the cafe had returned to a state of forced normalcy. Marcella, still indignant about Isabella's intervention, had stepped away from the counter, speaking in hushed tones with the staff and casting furtive glances toward the table where the two were seated. However, the atmosphere still carried a residue of the earlier tension, as if something more was yet to come. It was then that, as Isabella adjusted her bag on the table, something shimmered on Jape's wrist. Her eyes caught the glint of an old watch. For a moment she didn't pay much attention, but soon something about the accessory drew her in. There was something incredibly familiar about the shape and style of the watch. She blinked a few times, as if trying to push away a distant memory that was starting to resurface. "Mr. J," she said, her tone now tinged with curiosity. "May I see your watch?" JPE, a bit confused, stopped eating and looked at his wrist as if he had forgotten he was still wearing the accessory. "Oh, of course." He began to carefully unfasten the strap, and as he handed the watch to Isabella, he commented, "It's a keepsake from someone very important." Isabella took the watch in her hands, her fingers trembling. The cool texture of the metal took her back to memories she had locked away long ago. She turned the watch over to examine the back, and suddenly her heart raced. Engraved on the underside, in delicate letters, was a name that made her shudder. Emmanuel. She brought a hand to her mouth in shock. That watch! It was the same one she had given as a gift many years ago to the person who meant everything in her life. That watch belonged to Emmanuel, the man she had loved and tragically lost. How had that object come to JPE? "Where did you get this watch?" Isabella's voice trembled as she asked the question. She couldn't take her eyes off the object, as if it had reopened a wound she thought had healed. JPE, sensing the emotion in Isabella's eyes, was confused for a moment. "It was a gift," he said hesitantly, "a gift from my son, Emmanuel." His words hit Isabella like a blow. Her suspicions were correct. Jape's son was the same Emmanuel who had been her great love, the man whose death she mourned to this day. Her heart raced, and a mix of sadness, surprise, and longing flooded her chest. JPE, not fully understanding her reaction, continued, "Emmanuel, he passed away many years ago. After he left, life was never the same." Isabella felt tears begin to form in her eyes, but she fought to maintain her composure. The shock of the discovery was overwhelming. Emmanuel had disappeared from her life so abruptly, and she never had the chance to say goodbye properly. Now here was his father, a man shattered by the circumstances of life, holding the only object that connected her to her past. He was my... Isabella tried to find the words, but the emotions were choking her. JPE, noticing her state, began to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. "You knew my son?" JPE asked, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and pain. Isabella nodded, unable to speak. Immediately she looked at JPE with a blend of affection and sadness. "I loved him," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I loved him more than anything in this world." The silence that followed between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. JPE appeared shocked, unable to process what he had just heard. Isabella, on the other hand, held the watch tightly, as if fearing that this small piece of him might be ripped away from her again. "Why didn't I ever know about you?" JPE finally asked, his voice a blend of curiosity and sorrow. Isabella took a deep breath, preparing to revisit the wounds of her past. "It's a long story," she began, looking into the eyes of the man who suddenly seemed much more than just a needy stranger. "But now I think we need to talk." Isabella held Emmanuel's watch carefully, as if it were made of fragile glass capable of shattering at any moment. Every detail of the object transported her to a time she thought she had left behind. The worn shine, the discreet engraving underneath, and the way Emmanuel used to twist it on his wrist while they talked. Everything came rushing back like an avalanche, overwhelming her emotions and bringing her back to those days she would never forget. JPE watched her, his eyes watery from a confusion that was beginning to dissolve into understanding. He recognized that look, the look of someone who had deeply loved his son, someone who felt the same pain he had carried since Emmanuel's loss. The connection between them was undeniable. "He never mentioned you," JPE said, his voice hoarse and low. He seemed reluctant, as if unsure whether he was ready to hear what Isabella had to say, but at the same time he felt he needed to know. Isabella sighed, still holding the watch between her fingers. "I don't know where to begin," she said with a melancholic tone, her heart heavy with memories. "I met Emmanuel when we were young. I worked in a boutique, my first opportunity in the city. He used to come by with donations for the orphanage where I had grown up, and that's how we got close." Jape's eyes widened. "Orphanage?" She nodded slowly, her eyes glazed over with memories. "Yes, I was raised there since I was a child. I wasn't fortunate enough to know my parents, but the orphanage became my home. It was there that I met Emmanuel. He was always kind, devoted, so full of life. We had many plans together, plans for the future, until fate changed everything." JPE fell silent, absorbing every word. Isabella's pain reflected his own. But now hearing her story, he realized there was a part of Emmanuel's life he had never known, a side of his son he lost before he could fully understand. His heart tightened with longing, but also with gratitude for finding someone who shared that love. "I never knew about that part of his life," JPE murmured, lowering his head. "After Emmanuel died, Victoria, my wife, always blamed someone. She would say he distanced himself because of a woman, but she never told me the details. All I knew was that after his death nothing was the same." Isabella looked at JPE with deep empathy. "And how did you end up here?" she asked softly, as if each word needed to be carefully chosen to avoid reopening wounds. JPE let out a deep sigh, the weight of his story making his shoulders slump even more. "After Emmanuel died, Victoria, like she was never the same. She sank into grief, and I lost my footing too. Our marriage couldn't withstand it. The guilt and mourning drove us apart, and I ended up distancing myself from everything. We had a comfortable life, but the emptiness he left was unbearable. Victoria always blamed me," JPE said, his voice choked. "She would say that if I had been firmer with Emmanuel, he would have chosen another path, stayed away from you. And in my weakness, I believed for a long time that she was right." Hearing this, Isabella felt a heavy weight in her chest. It wasn't easy for her to hear that Victoria saw her as the reason for the family's collapse. "JPE," she said gently, "it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. Sometimes life takes us down paths we can't foresee or control. What happened was an accident, but the love Emmanuel had for you and for me, that love was real. None of this can be diminished by accusations." JPE looked at Isabella with tear-filled eyes, clearly touched by her words. "I never thought I would meet you one day, that I would discover who the woman my son loved truly was. This means so much to me." Isabella reached out over the table, lightly touching Jape's hand. "We both share the same loss, and somehow that connects us. I don't know why fate brought us here today, but I know we're together now, and maybe that means something greater." They fell silent for a few moments, processing the revelations and the feelings that accompanied them. Emmanuel's watch was still in Isabella's hands, and she carefully returned it to JPE, who placed it back on his wrist with a solemn look. "This watch," Isabella said, her voice soft, "is more than an accessory. It's a symbol of the time we spent with him, of what we shared. And as painful as it is, it also reminds me that time continues to pass, and that we need to find ways to move forward." JPE smiled sadly, understanding the depth of those words. "I don't know how to move on," he admitted sincerely. "After we lost everything, Victoria and I, we ended up on the streets. And now we're just surviving." Isabella felt a wave of empathy so strong that it made her shift in her chair. "And where is Victoria now?" she asked, her heart tightening. "She's waiting for me in a nearby square. We have nowhere to go, and she's even more broken than I am." Isabella took a deep breath, sensing that there was something greater to be done. "I want to see Victoria," she said firmly. "I want to help both of you. I can't change the past, but I can try to improve the future." Isabella's heart raced as she walked alongside JPE through the bustling streets of the city. The words they had exchanged in the cafe still echoed in her mind. The father of the man she had loved was at her side, and now about to meet the woman who had always despised her. Isabella knew the moment would be difficult, but something inside her told her this was the right step to take. JPE guided her in silence, his steps slow and weary, as if the weight of the years and hardships had drained all the energy he once had. Isabella's eyes wandered through the city, but her mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. Reuniting with Victoria was something she had never imagined. The memory of Emmanuel's mother made her tremble, but she knew she had to face it. Finally, after a few minutes, they arrived at a small square hidden between old buildings. It was a tranquil but worn place where a few people sat on benches or strolled leisurely. And there, under the shade of a large tree, sat Victoria. The contrast between the woman Isabella had known in the past and the fragile figure sitting in the shade was shocking. Victoria, once proud and immaculate, was now hunched over, wrapped in an old tattered coat, her gray hair carelessly tied back. Her eyes, once filled with pride, were now dull, staring into nothing as she held a small bag beside her. JPE approached carefully, as if fearing to awaken a sleeping beast. Isabella followed closely, her heart in her throat. When they got close enough, Victoria lifted her eyes with an expression of exhaustion. They quickly turned to surprise and distress upon seeing a stranger next to her husband. "JPE," Victoria murmured, her voice hoarse and weakened. "Who is this woman?" JPE hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Victoria, this is Isabella. She was someone important to Emmanuel." The name Emmanuel fell between them like a stone thrown into a still lake, creating ripples of tension and repressed emotions. Victoria's eyes widened upon hearing the name, and she immediately recognized who stood before her. "Isabella," Victoria said, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. You are the woman who took him away from us, the cause of all our misery." The accusation was strong and cutting, and Isabella felt the impact of those words like daggers. But she took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. "I understand that you see me this way," Isabella said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm here to help. We can't change what happened in the past, but perhaps we can find a way to move forward." Victoria shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the bag tighter. You don't understand. I lost everything. Everything. My son's life. Nothing makes sense anymore." "What?" Isabella felt a tightness in her chest, seeing the raw pain in Victoria's eyes. There was no denying that this woman was completely devastated by Emmanuel's loss. JPE knelt beside Victoria, holding her hands gently. "Dear, I know you've suffered. I have too. But we found Isabella by chance today, and she's willing to help us. Perhaps it's time to stop running from the past." "Yeah." Victoria looked from JPE to Isabella, her expressions mixing confusion and pain. "Why now?" Victoria asked, narrowing her eyes as if searching for a hidden motive in Isabella's intentions. "Why, after everything we've been through, would you show up to help us? You owe us nothing." Isabella stepped forward, kneeling beside JPE to be at Victoria's level. Her eyes were filled with compassion, and her voice was soft but heavy with emotion. "I loved Emmanuel, and that is something that I know we've lost so much. But I'm here to try to do something he would have wanted. He taught me to forgive, to care for others, and I believe that wherever he is, he would want me to reach out to you." Victoria was silent for a long moment, and the gentle wind passing through the trees seemed to be the only thing moving in that square. Isabella could see the internal battle in Victoria's eyes, a struggle between wounded pride and the desire to finally let the past rest. Finally, Victoria sighed a long, tired breath, as if she were releasing years of accumulated tension. "I don't know what to say." "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," Isabella said with an encouraging smile. "But let me try to help. Let's take it one step at a time. The important thing is that you know you will always have a home wherever you are, and I will always be here to help." Victoria looked at JPE, who was gazing at her with an encouraging look, as if saying they could finally move forward. She took a deep breath before slowly nodding. "Maybe it's time to start over. But I want to do it knowing we're not alone. You will never be alone," Isabella assured her. "This is a journey we will take together." In the days that followed, Isabella dedicated herself to helping the couple find a new home. They consulted real estate listings, visited different neighborhoods, and after a few weeks, they found a small house, simple but welcoming. It was located in a quiet neighborhood near a park where JPE and Victoria could stroll and perhaps begin their lives anew, with some normalcy. When the house was chosen, Isabella helped organize the move and ensured everything was ready to welcome them. The first night in the new home was exciting for everyone. JPE and Victoria, despite their nervousness, were happy to be able to call that place home. The small living room, with its simple furniture and soft light, symbolized a new beginning. That night, as Isabella said goodbye to the couple in front of their new home, JPE warmly embraced her. "You've given us something we can never repay, Isabella. The chance to be a family again." Isabella smiled, moved. "You don't need to repay me. Just live this new life with all the love and gratitude in your hearts. That's more than enough." Victoria, who had previously hesitated to show her feelings, stepped forward and hugged Isabella tightly as well. "I never thought I could forgive or move on, but now I see that forgiveness sets us free, and I'm grateful for you giving us this chance. We're all healing together," Isabella said, looking at both of them with an affectionate smile. And Emmanuel would be happy to see this. As Isabella stepped away, leaving JPE and Victoria on the threshold of their new home, she felt a lightness in her heart. The past had been painful, but finally, they were all finding a way to peace. A few weeks passed since JPE and Victoria moved into their new home. The adjustment process was slow, but the couple began to create a new routine. The simplicity of life in that small home brought a tranquility they hadn't experienced in a long time. The walks in the park, the conversations at the dinner table, and the small moments of shared silence were a balm for their souls. Isabella visited them often, always attentive to ensure they lacked nothing. The visits, which had started as short and formal, now became long and relaxed. They laughed together, shared stories, and talked about the future. Isabella had not only helped them find a new physical home, but also an emotional one, a place where forgiveness and love could flourish. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, Isabella decided to do something special. She invited JPE and Victoria to spend the day at her house. She had a surprise planned, something that could further strengthen the bonds they had built. When the couple arrived at Isabella's home, they were greeted with a warm smile and the aroma of a delicious lunch prepared with care. The atmosphere was light, and the sunlight streaming through the windows brought a sense of renewal. "You've come on the perfect day," Isabella said, guiding them to the dining room. "I have a surprise." JPE and Victoria exchanged curious glances, confident that whatever Isabella had prepared would be meaningful. They sat at the table, admiring the arrangement of the dishes and the simple yet elegant decor. Before they could ask, the door to the living room opened, and a tall, smiling young man walked in. Isabella immediately stood up and walked toward him, her eyes shining with pride. "JPE, Victoria, I want you to meet Esteban, my son," Isabella said, her voice filled with emotion. "He just returned from university and was eager to meet you." Victoria's face lit up and Jape's eyes sparkled with genuine joy. Esteban approached the table, extending his hand to greet them. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Esteban said with a warm smile, shaking Jape's hand and giving a gentle hug to Victoria, who welcomed him with a tender look. "You look a lot like your mother," JPE commented with a light laugh. "And it's clear she raised you well." Isabella watched the scene with a heart full of gratitude. This was more than just a family gathering. It was the consolidation of a new beginning, an expansion of the circle of love and forgiveness she had been carefully building. She knew that, in a way, Esteban's presence symbolized the continuation of Emmanuel's legacy. He never had the chance to know their son, but now JPE and Victoria were meeting Isabella's son, a part of her life that represented the future. During lunch, the conversations flowed easily. JPE and Victoria, who once carried the weight of years of pain and suffering, seemed renewed. After the meal, Isabella suggested that everyone go to the garden for coffee. Esteban, attentive and careful, helped JPE walk to the outdoor area, while Victoria and Isabella chatted happily about the flowers lining the path. Sitting outside with the sun setting in the background, The atmosphere was one of pure serenity. Isabella looked around, and for a moment, everything seemed to be exactly as it should be. "I never thought I could have something like this again," Victoria said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The feeling of family, of belonging. I thought those things had died with Emmanuel." "We're rebuilding this together, Victoria." Isabella gently held her hand. "And now we have a new chance to create good memories, to live more lightly." JPE, who had been gazing at the horizon, spoke softly. "You know, Emmanuel left us much more than we realized. Even in his absence, he continues to unite us. I feel that somehow he is here, present, seeing that we finally found peace." Esteban, who had been listening attentively, leaned in and spoke with calm wisdom. "I believe that a person's legacy never completely disappears. Emmanuel was an important part of all your lives, but now you are all part of my story, my life, and I'm very happy about that." Victoria smiled, a tear rolling down her cheek, but this time it wasn't one of sadness. "You're very kind, Esteban. I think in some way we're all connected by something greater." The rest of the afternoon was filled with deep conversations, laughter, and a feeling of reconciliation that hung in the air. As evening began to fall, Isabella took them back to their new home, and JPE and Victoria said goodbye with warm hugs, promising that this wouldn't be the last time they all gathered. As Isabella walked home with Esteban, she felt that finally, the cycle of pain and mourning was closing. The past would always be part of their lives, but the future now seemed brighter than ever. After months of pain and overcoming, Isabella, JPE, Victoria, and Esteban found the peace and love they had long sought. Each of them, marked by the past, learned to forgive and move forward, united by bonds deeper than blood. Isabella, who had carried the burden of losing Emmanuel, now felt gratitude and serenity. JPE and Victoria, once consumed by grief, rediscovered the joy of simple living and shared love. Esteban, with his youth and generosity, brought hope and continuity to his family. In the end, they became a new family, reborn through forgiveness and unity. Together, they built a home filled with love and hope, ready to face the future with strength, knowing that the past, though painful, no longer defined them. Love and forgiveness transformed them, allowing them to find a new beginning full of light and possibilities. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to be the first to receive the next video. Share with your friends and check out the video on the end screen. You'll be moved.